I'm Frank Uciardo. Welcome to International Dateline. In this segment, we'll be looking at a recent forum on cultural diplomacy that examines alternative ways UN member states can influence understanding in the world around them. First, this news update. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan returned to the UN to sign his new book and talk about his efforts to end the crisis in Syria.
My main concern was the Syrians and their welfare. How do you argue that trying to resolve it peacefully led to more killings? We need leadership both from President Obama and President Putin.
Mr. Annan said many people in the region were not in favor of the peace talks. In Washington, D.C., well, that was the dateline for the ICD annual conference on cultural diplomacy. Diplomats and international affairs experts there explored the use of cultural diplomacy, soft power, intercultural dialogue, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. We begin our story now with how the newsmakers in Washington framed the topic.
Well, cultural diplomacy is going to help in better understanding in bringing people together in terms of what is in their best interest in the future. You know, in Afghanistan, gradually people have realized that war is not a solution. People are tired of war. However, there are many misperceptions, mistrust. Cultural diplomacy can help remove this mistrust and bring people together in the interest of common, kind of a future that they have in this country.
Where does soft power come from? Comes from Professor Nye of Harvard, who introduced the topic in 1990. And he stressed the importance of power with rather than power over. In other words, cooperation, working with other countries rather than, well, dominating other countries, stressing cultural power, diplomatic/political power, economic power, all of the things in addition to hard military power.
The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is an international not-for-profit organization. Its mission is to promote global peace and stability. The ICD is one of Europe's largest independent cultural organizations. It supports and strengthens intercultural relations at all levels. The global organization has seen impressive growth over the last decade, attracting prestigious diplomats, scholars, and professionals from around the world who participate in ICD conferences like the one here in Washington. Member states here at the UN frequently host performances by musical artists as a way of employing cultural diplomacy to get their messages across.
I haven't even touched one iota of what I want to do for and through the United Nations to help heal this world.
Now, of course, culture is referred to as a soft power tool. But you know, I grew up under communist domination. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. And trust me, rock and roll music, American cinema, blue jeans, Coca-Cola. If you told me that these, just think of it, these instruments of power are not as soft as one would think. When you think about the impact, when you think about the impact it had on my mind and on my heart.
And we believe that what we call cultural relations are quite simply the most essential dimension for achieving global development, global security, and global prosperity. Cultural relations is the phrase we prefer to use rather than cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy. Cultural relations, we believe, captures what is most essential, and that is the people-to-people relationship, particularly in this 21st century world of the power of popular engagement.
Cultural diplomacy, I think, has evolved. It is not only pop culture, it is not only sending musicians, it's not only sending a basketball player or a football player, but now with the new challenges of radicalisms, of terrorisms, it has changed dramatically the nature. It has to be more on the establishment of partnerships, on the creation of understanding, removal of stereotyping and de-radicalizations. That should be the agenda.
I think cultural diplomacy is the diplomacy of the voice of the people. And that's a different definition than you usually hear. Traditionally, diplomacy has cultural diplomacy. People have thought of it in terms of arts and culture, but I think we've got to look at a broader definition in this age of 24/7 communication and citizen journalism, and this age when we see all over the world the voice of the people becoming a more important factor in political change. So cultural diplomacy is very much a part of soft power, which Joseph Nye has defined as, well, I think, as the power of attraction, the power, the ability to be able to persuade by non-coercive means. And I think something that you've seen, I've been coming to these conferences now for many years, 5, 6, 7 even, an increasing interest in cultural diplomacy and people seeing it as something really quite broad. I would say really the broad alternative to traditional hard power.
I know many people involved with cultural diplomacy, culture itself, traditional diplomacy, are often uncomfortable with power, not least American power, but it's very important to appreciate that power, hard power, and I have a liberal definition of, an encompassing definition of what hard power represents, is the foundation on which much of soft power really rests.
The use of cultural diplomacy to improve relations between the U.S., Russia, and China was the focus of one panel hosted by the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy.
So I think one of the basic challenges is that when we engage in these conversations, and particularly from a U.S. side, it is often very challenging to recognize the extent to which the question of culture is present in what other people are bringing to the conversation and is often located in a different place, even if you're aware of how it might be located differently in the conversation with respect to what is important. And this is something I've seen over and over again.
We think about cultural diplomacy as a mitigating factor in international relations. It's important to understand what Dr. Albrow was saying is that culture means different things, not only in the cultures of their governments and their historical politics between the United States, China, and Russia, but also as a result of its different meanings, different institutions develop around those meanings with different expectations and different modalities.
Culture can really fight dictatorship, how free and independent cultural life can make a life of any dictator much harder, and how it can be very much supported from the outside with what you called soft power as a tool of diplomacy to support free cultural and democratization movements.
As we invest in all the things essential to cultural diplomacy, language, education, exchanges, let's not forget to invest in our cultural values. We should respect the views of others, but we should not shirk from advocating our own.
For soft diplomacy, we've learned, 1, it's necessary to understand and respect the challenges and successes of the individual players. 2, to come to the table without ego. Take a back seat and listen, even when you disagree. 3, be bold enough to give the players an opportunity to work together by empowering them to find the solution to problems.
Mark Donfrey, the General Director and founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, explained the mission of the organization.
The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is primarily focused on 3 things: research, teaching, and programs in the field of cultural diplomacy. Unfortunately, there's very little research in the field of cultural diplomacy, both in terms of the USA, which is the focus of this conference, as well as internationally. So we're trying any way we can to really ask the questions. What was cultural diplomacy? What is cultural diplomacy? And what can it be in the future? And that's reflective also in our teaching, where we offer also graduate courses, MA programs in cultural diplomacy, electronic learning courses. And then through our programs, we're really trying to educate, enhance, and sustain relationships through conferences such as this, as well as the programs that we have for young leaders. So those are the main areas that ICD is focusing on.
U.S. Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs Tara Sonnenschein talked to the ICD conference about maximizing the opportunities for cultural diplomacy.
We have to build a stronger, more robust domestic constituency for our international engagement, inclusive of cultural diplomacy and cuisine diplomacy and sports and film and some of the traditionally not so soft forms of diplomacy, like countering violent extremism online.
We'll have more on cultural diplomacy when International Dateline returns after these words.
Everyone likes to keep things cool, but some appliances contain gases that are harmful to the ozone layer and harmful for our planet. You can help protect it by buying products that don't contain nasty gases. Look for non-HCFC air conditioners in the store. Easier on the wallet, easier on the planet. Now, that's what I call cool.
Welcome back to International Dateline as we continue our report on cultural diplomacy. We begin this segment with a discussion on how cultural diplomacy can be used to strengthen transatlantic relationships and the future of U.S. foreign policy with regard to potential roles of soft power, intercultural dialogue, and cultural diplomacy.
The puzzle is that this country attracts, but it also repels. Joe Nye gave us a term to describe the attraction with soft power, the ability of a country to achieve its goals abroad without having to exercise military or economic pressure, thanks to the attractiveness of its culture, its social system, and its behavior in the international arena. The answer to why we have often had a difficult encounter with the rest of the world comes in this country often not so much from studying other societies or listening with both of our ears to commentary from abroad as conducting what I've characterized as a monologue in which Americans notice resentment in foreigners and then explain why that resentment is irrational.
In Europe, we would like to have a more relation with America, but in a sense of intercultural dialogue, and not only, America as a lecturer, but more on dialogue.
Not only are soft power and public diplomacy useful for doing something broader than that, but they in fact are most useful, I think, for the dissemination of values of liberal governance, tolerance, and pluralism. So not only is the stuff of soft power human rights and values, but it actually can be most useful in helping bring about positive change, as long as it isn't in a bludgeoning fashion.
One of my favorite examples of cultural diplomacy is that there is a project called Salam Ola, which is promoted by the Azerbaijani musicians, in which they, together with Andean musicians, mostly Ecuadorians and Bolivians, sing together. And they don't, it's not that Bolivians sing Azerbaijani music or Azeris sing Bolivian music. Each of them plays their own music. Yet together it produces a fantastic effect of commonality. I didn't know we had so much in common.
I think there, as we look at really the interdependent nature of today's society, what's needed today is not, let's say, propaganda or persuasion, which tended to be the past of cultural diplomacy. What's needed is understanding and trust. And I think in that sense, that's the parallel mission to the UN in terms of how do we build more understanding, how do we build more trust so that we can deal with these issues collectively, multilaterally, as opposed to unilaterally.
And that's this edition of International Dateline. Reporting from the United Nations, I'm Frank Uciardo. Thanks for joining us.